Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first speaker event of the new school year. I hope you're all well, and thank you all for coming today. Before we start, I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that the territory the Wilson Institute for Canadian History currently sits on is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And though we are meeting here today in a virtual setting, I'd like to invite you all to reflect on the territories you reside on, the impact of settler colonialism on Indigenous peoples, and how you can help fight racism and inequality in your everyday lives. I'd also like to thank Indigenous Studies, and in particular, Carrie, for helping me putting this together and getting the word out as well. Today's talk is part of our general series called Racialized People and Democracy. And initially, this series was supposed to take place in person last winter and last spring, but of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to cut it short. However, after the important discussions that have taken place in Canada and around the world, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, we decided to not only revive the series, but we've also invited more guests in the process. These are very important discussions to have, and we're not going to let a virus stop them. So please do check out our website for more details and a list of speakers. Now, it's my pleasure today to welcome once again my very good friend, Dr. Elizabeth Ellis, to the Wilson Institute. Liz is a professor of Early American and Indigenous History and a co-director of the Native Studies Forum at New York University. She's an associate here at the Wilson Institute for Canadian History, an activist fighting for Indigenous rights in the United States, and more importantly, my personal go-to person when I have a general snarky comment to make about the subpar quality of New York bagels compared to Montreal bagels. Her groundbreaking work investigates the histories of Louisiana's small Indigenous polities during the 18th century and analyzes the way that these nations shaped European colonization efforts and influenced the lives of the inhabitants of the lower Mississippi Valley. Her work has been published in William & Mary Quarterly, America, Louisiana History, and the Washington Post, just to name a few. Today, Liz will present a paper titled The Border Crossed Us Too, the overlap between the struggles for migrant and Indigenous justice. Following her talk, we'll have a brief Q&A session. And now, without further ado, Dr. Elizabeth Ellis.
Thanks so much, Max, and thank you for having me. I know you can cast that shade at New York bagels since we're thousands of miles apart, and that feels, a little safer. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I was really disappointed not to be able to get to visit with all of the lovely folks at Indigenous Studies and the student and staff at McMaster and to be with you physically, but I am excited about the possibilities that these digital meetings, allow for gatherings across the continent. And so when Max and I had talked about the theme of this talk and more recently revisiting, as he mentioned, this was originally supposed to be last spring, thinking about the implications of COVID. In many ways, it feels like the issue around borders and migrations has become more urgent as a result of state-sanctioned violence and the tremendous deaths of migrants who have moved through U.S. detention centers. I also want to mention that I'm joining you all from Dakota and Anishinaabe homelands and Minneapolis, the site of the recent murder of George Floyd by police. And I raise these things both because although I'll be primarily focusing on migration tonight, it's abundantly clear that state-sanctioned violence and policing are the core of these issues, and that is therefore, Black and Indigenous feminists have been telling us forever, these are intertwined and intersecting problems and really need to be understood as such. But also I wanted to stress my grounding just because I approach this conversation from a context within the United States. And so much of my perspective on migration and the conversation around immigration in North America is framed from this lens. So I'll be excited for after, I'll try and keep this around over 20 minutes so we can have some conversation and broaden this out afterwards. All right, let me share my screen and set up this presentation. Okay, perfect. All right. So last week near San Diego, California, two Kumeyaay, land defenders were arrested on their own homelands as they attempted to halt constructions of the U.S.'s border wall with Mexico. For months now, a small group of Kumeyaay and their allies have been allied to thwart construction of the wall through lands that their nation recognizes as sacred. Over the course of the summer, these demonstrators, many of whom were young Kumeyaay women, have been harassed by ICE, white supremacist groups, local law enforcement, and they were recently served with an eviction notice from the Bureau of Land Management from their own ancestral homelands. Their fight constitutes a single and recent but critical part of the broader contest over the construction of a massive physical barrier along the United States southern border. It's also a powerful example of the sustained resistance of Indigenous communities and the deep historical framing of the fight at the border. As with so many Indigenous communities, Kumeyaay claims to caretake and control these lands today stem from hundreds of years of relationships to these lands and to the many people who've crossed over them across generations. So these are two Kumeyaay women standing at a recently constructed portion of the border wall, and the other two shots over here from Kumeyaay Land Defense, the Instagram, sort of showing the protest as it's unfolding. So on a national level, in the previous 4 years under the Trump administration, we spent a tremendous amount of time and energy debating the merits and architecture of the proposed walls along the US and Mexico border, travel bans, immigration quotas for specific countries, and the kinds of immigrants we would like to encourage to come to our nation. Within the last year, this debate feels like it's reached a new level of crisis as the federal government has used the COVID pandemic as an excuse to nearly halt all immigration to the United States. And the United States' brutal policies of housing migrants in large, dense detention centers with subpar hygienic facilities have put thousands more at risk for contracting COVID. And I feel like I should pause to point out that even as the Trump administration has stirred fears of immigrants carrying the disease across US soil, US policies have actually enabled the spread of COVID both within our own country and then exported it abroad as well. We've deported thousands of migrants who've been exposed to COVID since March back to their home countries. So for example, in April, I was in New York, sort of at the height of this crisis, and hundreds of people who had Guatemalan migrants who had tested positive for COVID were deported to their home countries. So far, at least 5,000 people have contracted COVID in ICE detention centers, including more than 800 in the last 2 weeks alone. In Canada, the conversation over immigration is perhaps less explosive, but the questions of Indigenous borders and how to think about incorporating newcomers in Truth and Reconciliation Canada remain fraught and high-stakes discussions. So as we become entangled in these debates over logistics, quotas, application processes, and other methods to restrict and tally human rights to migrate, we've missed one of the most fundamental challenges to both our current administration's efforts to stymie immigration based on religion and national origins, here I'm talking about the US, and become trapped in a conversation framed by settler logics of exclusion and belonging in North America. So if we reposition ourselves and think about migration not as US citizens, as undocumented or documented people, but about an issue fundamentally around settlers who've built lives and identities on Indigenous lands, and often at the expense of Indigenous people, this conversation looks very different. And critically, this reframing should draw us to question contemporary conversations about claims that the US and Canadian citizens are the only people who get to make decisions about who gets to belong to and control these territories, and their exclusive right to prevent others from living and working on these lands. So these are images from last year, obviously not from the middle of COVID when the issue over detention and family separation was exploding in the US last summer. So for years, the cry, "the border crossed us," has been something that Latino and Mexican communities on both sides of the US and Mexico border have embraced. The critique in this statement is that the imperial border severed Latino communities and Hispanic people who'd been living in North America, and in the Southwest in particular, long before the United States dumped a border that divided families across two separate states. If we expand this critique, however, we come to see that this border similarly severs Indigenous territories, and the US's current border cannot be understood as disconnected from our current administration's fight to refuse to recognize Native sovereignty and the internationalist perspectives and relationships of Native nations. So basically, the crux of this argument is that by bringing together indigenous ethics of caretaking with our discussion of migration and sort of a settler colonial framing will necessarily lead us to critique some of the ways we've been talking about the debate around migration and immigration within North America. And so what I want to suggest is that Native nations must not only be involved in conversations about what happens to the land and non-human relations, or natural resources, rivers, waters, earth on their homelands, but also that they should be able to make and impact policies about who gets to be on these lands. And here I don't just mean in the negative. I think a lot of the time we end up talking about the way that Indigenous nations fight hard to keep settlers and corporations and damaging infrastructure from invading into Indigenous territories. But I think I stress this in Native sovereignty in the inverse, meaning our ability to not just exclude, but also to welcome in foreigners on our own terms and as part of our practices of sovereignty and nationhood. So my talk today is going to provide a couple of snapshots of historical context to frame this conversation about borders, refugees, and migration, and then I'll return to our present context at the end. So I want to start in the American Southeast, where I'm most comfortable. I'm going to focus a little bit on this region between what's presently Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and then I will shift north in just a minute. So let's start in the South, and let's start early. For thousands of years before the creation of the United States and Mexico, Native people traveled, traded, and lived along lands where the international border between these two countries now stands. When the Spanish arrived on the Yucatan Peninsula in the early 16th century, Aztec trade routes extended as far south as Nicaragua today and north into what is New Mexico, connecting people across the region. So what I have here is just a mapping of the turquoise trade alone through this region, but there's all kinds of other materials, pine nuts, cocoa, feathers, things that are moving up north and south through this corridor. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Caddo, Ute, Comanche, and Apache people built towns and economies that likewise spread across the lands of southern Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as much of the Southwest remained a borderland. And what I mean by this is, to take from Kathleen Duvall's definition, who's on this call, is that it was controlled by a variety of different polities whose sovereignties and uses of space sometimes overlapped. So for example, in the land that's presently Texas, Native people had concrete conceptions of their territory. And what this meant was that nations like the Karanakawa and Hassani all regulated who crossed into their homelands and who was able to access the resources within their lands. But they also worked out arrangements to share and jointly manage resources and policies by which others could pass through their homelands. I know this a little bit flies in the face of some of the conceptions we might have about Indigenous people not owning property or not possessing hard borders. And I think owning is definitely the wrong word here, but basically you might translate this as having rights to access certain kinds of resources through relationships to people and places. And if you're interested in this, Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places or Juliana Barr's article in the William Mary Quarterly on Geographies of Power are really great resources for understanding Native territoriality in this place. Okay. So as we all know, the arrival of Europeans who carried pathogens, new trade, and conflicts to North America generated great violence, upheaval, political turmoil, and reinvention. And basically in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, this causes huge numbers of people to migrate across North America. Some of this migration is emergency migration, so people fleeing violence in their homelands, seeking refuge elsewhere. Some of it is for economic opportunities, seeking to take advantage of new trade or shifting political circumstances. And others of it are simply political splits or divisions among Native nations where communities branch off and decide to start something new on their own. And so long before the creation of nation states, which is how we usually think about nations now, and which I should clarify is by nature an exclusionary political formation, meaning that a nation state, right, is inherently built on borders exclusive subjecthood or citizenship based maybe on birthright or bloodline. But that basically in the Southeast at this time, Native nations were managing considerable populations of refugees and migrants in their territories without these hardened concept of exclusionary nation states. And they managed to do this in ways that both helped ensure the survival of their own groups and strengthened the nations who came to join them. So I want to look quickly at the Lower Mississippi Valley, which is the region where I study in my broader research in the late 17th and 18th century. And so during this time period, this region becomes a hub for migrants from across the Southeast, the Ohio River Valley, and folks who move down the edge of the plains through Arkansas and Kansas. To help manage the massive movements of people into this region, the groups who lived in this region developed processes and protocols for bringing outsiders into their nations, and specifically ways of dealing with outsiders that allowed for both short-term and long-term refuge. So what I've got circled here, I mentioned the Hassanais before, that's just up. That's the red square in the upper left corner, just as a note. But so this is a snapshot of the Mobile Bay in the early 18th century. So this would be in what is present-day Alabama. If you go to the left, you move into Mississippi, and then Louisiana. To the right is the sort of, the downward point of Florida over there. And what I've done is to circle all groups who are refugees who moved to the Mobile Bay between the 1690s and the 1720s. And you can see I've labeled the French writing at the bottom, as well as highlighted the place on the map where in northern Florida there's a mention of the destruction of Appalachian settlements. But basically the point here is that the two indigenous nations who were already on the Mobile River Bay, the Mobilians and the Tahomey, during this time period welcomed 4 groups of new refugees who they allowed to settle intact in their communities alongside their homelands, because they saw this as a benefit. They saw this as strengthening their communities, as ways to bring in outsiders and take advantage of the trade that they would bring, the defensive numbers against colonial forces. They also take in French immigrants, the small settlement at Mobile by French folks, but that we might look at this and say, oh my goodness, they're outnumbered in their own homelands, right? This is reminiscent of the rhetoric we're using today, but that's not how indigenous people saw it at this time period. And for them, there was no reason that as long as the foreigners were good relations and broadly abided by the sort of, rules is the wrong word, but basically behaved within ways that were acceptable to Mobilian and Tahomey people, these other 4 groups ultimately were able to stay in the region and to build new lives alongside of the original people there without having to sacrifice their ethnic differences, their language, and anything else. And I think this is this is one example, but it's very common in this region of the ways that Native nations strengthen themselves through embracing outside migrants. Okay. So it's not actually until 1848, at the close of the Mexican-American War, that the modern US and Mexico borders created. And this imperial border, which is negotiated by 2 states, cuts right through the homelands of existing Native nations. We've shifted a little west again. You can see the edge of Louisiana where I was talking about on the edge of this marker of the Guadalupe Hidalgo treaty line. So the United States only hardened the US-Mexico border in the 20th century, which remained contested through a lot of the 19th century, with the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924, which was intent on controlling and restricting migration, mostly from Mexico. Subsequent mass deportations and shifts in US policy, including during the Great Depression and later during Operation Wetback, that is the formal name of the operation during the 1950s, further reinforced the border. And many Native nations have refused to recognize the US's northern and southern borders. However, and have argued that they split existing nations and ignore claims that pre-existed the US. So even as this border is coming into being, it's being hardened and it's attempted to first be enforced, Native nations are contesting this, folks on the ground are contesting this, and they're continuing to have and hold community across the imposition of this line. So if we turn our attention to the north, something that perhaps for you folks in Canada is much more familiar, Indigenous people met with significant success as they fought the imposition of borders during the late 18th and 19th century. So for centuries, for example, Mohawk folks have fought the US and Canadian attempts to patrol, police, militarize, and enforce the border that bisects their homelands along the St. Lawrence and St. Regis rivers. In the 1790s, the United States was forced to recognize the rights of Native people to migrate because of its position of military weakness and political vulnerability. So the fledgling United States during this period, right after the American Revolution, is forced to negotiate not only with Britain, but also with powerful Native nations like Haudenosaunee and Cherokee folks. And so they end up both recognizing Haudenosaunee rights to territory in upstate New York and the right of Indigenous peoples to migrate across the US border as they had previously. To be clear, many Mohawk people today reject both US and Canadian citizenship and travel instead on Haudenosaunee passports, insisting on moving freely within their ancestral homelands. Right, this is the crux of the ongoing dispute that explodes periodically. I'm thinking of Akwesasne in the 1990s, the debate over cigarettes and taxes. But I'm pointing to the 1790s in particular and the negotiation around this agreement because it has really important legal implications for Native migration today. And because it highlights that historically both the US and Canada understood Indigenous people as having separate rights to migrate exclusive of settler states. So the rights of Indigenous peoples whose nations are currently encompassed by Canada, First Nations, actually have explicit rights to cross the border into the US to work, visit, or live. And although this is heavily couched in racist blood quantum logics, I'll come back to this in a minute, it's actually something that is not enforced, is not recognized for Native folks living in the United States who wish to cross into Canada. There's not a sort of reciprocal end to that. And this, of course, both of these framings exclude our Indigenous relatives from further south. There's no comparable law or treaty that recognizes similar rights for Southern Indigenous migrants. While the United States negotiated a treaty in the North from a position of relative weakness in the 1790s, by the mid-19th century, the US had vastly expanded its military might and was in the process of a genocidal campaign to remove and exterminate Indigenous peoples from lands in the Southeast and Southwest. Additionally, the development of new racial logics that excluded both Indigenous and Spanish-speaking people from participation in the American states and justified their dispossessions helped create the artificial divide between Indigenous peoples north and south of the 1848 border. So, but as we all know, despite US claims to have completely conquered Indigenous people, the continued existence of Native nations along the northern and southern borders and their persistence as viable, continuing, vibrant Native nations on their original homelands challenges federal claims to exclusive territory and jurisdiction in these areas. Southern Native nations continue to challenge both the southern border and migration policies. And to pick one of the splashiest, or I guess the most publicized examples of this in recent years, within Ta'ana O'odham, whose lands and communities straddle the US and Mexico border, and between Arizona and Sonora, they vehemently opposed the extension of the border wall through their territories for years. So like Kumeyaay, the Tohono O'odham lived on these lands for hundreds of years before the birth of the United States, and the proposed expansion of the border wall constitutes a direct assault on their sovereignty as well as a true severing of communities. So Verlon Jose, who was vice chairman of the Tohono O'odham in 2017, powerfully rejected the government's claims to exert their borders across his people's homelands. And in a statement that would become famous, he says, "Only over my dead body will the wall be built." And this fight has continued from 2017 throughout 2018-19 and continues today. Just within the last weeks, these are photos from early in September. There have been multiple arrests in O'odham territory as younger organizers who lead the Tohono O'odham Anti-Border Collective have turned to direct action as a way to stop the desecration of their sacred lands, of lands they recognize as their ancestors being buried in, as their caretaking obligations to springs and animals. But basically they decided to use their bodies and to use similar tactics to what we saw at Standing Rock, standing in front of bulldozers, physically obstructing construction. And so this fight is very much ongoing at the moment, both in Kumeyaay and in Tohono O'odham territory. So unfortunately, to Verlon's point, already far too many Indigenous people have been sacrificed along the increasingly militarized US-Mexico border. Between 2003 and 2018, 97 migrants died either in custody or at the hands of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And since 1994, more than 8,000 people have died attempting to cross this border. And the federal government has ramped up immigration enforcement, this has only become a more dangerous prospect. Okay, I'm going to escape and end the slideshow. So what I want to ask, though, is what if, beyond rejecting structures of colonial exclusion and severance, we could offer welcome and asylum? So obviously we're not static people or nations, right? And our modern nations and governance structures look very different today than they did 200 or 300 years ago, the examples that, I've talked about. But it seems to me that it's largely settler law that has stopped us from bringing in outsiders, not the traditional laws and governance structures of our nations. Of course, nations can choose to bring in or choose not to bring in outsiders based on the current needs and resources available within their own nations. But the point I want to make is that Indigenous ethics of caretaking, perspectives on governance, and policies for managing land and resources are missing from our current negotiations around borders and migration. So why is it that the US and Canada get to decide who can come onto these lands? I think a two-part theoretical and practical shift in our approaches to these crises that migrants are enduring in North America helps us see the struggles for Native sovereignty and for migrant rights as deeply, deeply intertwined. The first shift is this positivist discourse about incorporation. So we're so often focused on exclusion, on keeping folks out, on making sure that there are not people invading territories or claiming to be Indigenous when they are not. But if we seriously consider our histories of incorporation, it would seem to me that we have an obligation now to reconsider our defensive desire to keep others out. This is especially true considering that so many Southern migrants to the US are Indigenous themselves. Moreover, if we look at our own histories, for many of us, we will see again and again that Native nations successfully incorporated outsiders and or provided refuge for groups in crisis. The second part of this is that, as we know, the logic of exclusivity is in part based on racial ideas of blood quantum, pure Indigenous ancestry, and other kinds of racial fictions that are actually designed to dispossess us. And so our critiques of indigeneity as a purely genetic matter should naturally extend to being unable to why we are unable to see our Southern Indigenous relatives as part of the same struggles, right? For example, we very rarely, I know some of you are well ahead of this, but we very rarely talk about the violence that Indigenous women are facing at the US-Mexico, at the southern border, and throughout the southern half of the North American continent, as in conversation with our missing and murdered Two-Spirit women, girls, and other relatives. So, like exclusionary borders, racially exclusionary logics of Native citizenship are also fairly recent inventions. Native nations certainly have long histories of taking in refugees and adopting outsiders. And although in the US today, when we talk about Native people, we often operate under this fiction of some form of pure blood, Cherokee, Paiute, Kiowa, whatever. For thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, Native nations adopted and integrated outsiders, and this really continued throughout most of the 19th century, or up until the 19th century, I'm sorry. So, for examples, during the 17th century, Haudenosaunee people rebuilt parts of their confederacy after devastating bouts of disease by integrating outsiders from other nations. In the Southeast, Chickasaws integrated so many outsiders during the 18th century that by the 1770s, Northwest, a Chickasaw leader, described the nation as primarily composed of non-ethnic Chickasaws, meaning the majority of people would not have been what we would have categorized as ethnically Chickasaw folks. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Native nations also took in Europeans and Africans and integrated them as full members of their nations, and they continued this practice into the 19th century. So in my own nation, for example, we're descendants of the Illinois Confederacy, and we took in large groups of French settlers in the 17th and 18th century, and then refugee groups from across the eastern woodlands in the 19th century as we got pushed west. And then in the 20th century in Oklahoma, we got reconfederated as a group of 4 different Native nations to form the Peoria Nation. So thinking specifically about my heritage, this not bringing in outsiders thing seems absolutely bananas as a concept because we would not have survived without it. As another kind of maybe, geographically relevant historical example, during the 1870s, Plains Ojibwe folks in what is now North Dakota took in hundreds of Métis people, refugees who were forced to flee Canada after the collapse of the Louis Riel rebellions. The descendants of these Plains Ojibwe and Métis refugees are today recognized as the nation of Turtle Mountain Chippewa. These practices were so prevalent, in fact, that during the 19th century, the federal government perceived the ability of Native nations to provide sanctuary to, quote, outsiders and to integrate non-ethnically Indigenous newcomers as serious challenges to the potential threats to U.S. sovereignty. So again, just one example here. In the mid-19th century, the Supreme Court was explicitly challenging the rights of Native nations to continue to integrate non-ethnically Indigenous people. In 1846, the Supreme Court heard the case of William Rogers, an Anglo-American man who'd been brought into the Cherokee Nation, adopted, you could say, and was accused of murdering another Anglo-American man, Jacob Nicholson, who was also part of the Cherokee Nation. Both men were living within the territory of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. So under U.S. law at this point, this should have meant that this was a Cherokee matter to be deliberated by Cherokee governance on Cherokee land involving Cherokees. The court nonetheless ruled that although the men had become Cherokee, they remained white men, so racially what they would have described as non-Indian, and thus Rogers could be tried in a U.S. Circuit Court for his crimes. In effect, the Supreme Court ruled that race trumped geographical jurisdiction and Indigenous abilities to confer citizenship and kinship when it came to enforcing U.S. laws over Native nations and territories. The question is, would this same kind of racialized logic hold up in court today? And are there ways to work around the logics that have caught us in the cycle of dispossession of both kin and lands? This is actually less a radical departure from our existing theoretical and practical conversations about migration and Indigenous sovereignty than might initially appear. But those familiar with the work of Harsha Walia, and immigrant rights groups that are already employing this rhetoric and educating folks who arrive on Indigenous homelands about their context are doing this in practice. Moreover, there are examples from the last 10 years where Aboriginal rights organizations in Australia granted passports to migrants held in detention centers who had been unable to immigrate to Australia. This was more form than function. It was a gesture of welcome from Aboriginal communities and a challenge to Australian sovereignty. These passports did not allow the folks to travel, but I think they present an important theoretical challenge to the framework of exclusion in these contexts. So this is really more about connection and extension rather than a dramatic reframing of the logics we think we know already within Indigenous studies and then the way that we're increasingly talking about migration. So if we recognize the treaty sovereignty and real modern sovereignty of Native nations, real control over our borders, and a history of incorporation and refugee welcome as ways to strengthen our nations and build power, we must begin to reconsider Indigenous perspectives of not just exclusion and stopping borders and infrastructure, but also fighting for our ability to welcome newcomers and arrivants as our ancestors have done for generations. Thank you.